afternoon, and welcome to Colossal Fossils here. We're a couple minutes ahead, and just kind of getting set up. Our program today is a little bit hard to see without some good light, so I think we got enough light set up here. And we'll be getting started in just a minute. Just a couple of minutes anyway. All right, afternoon, folks. Welcome to the group. So, while we're waiting for everybody to show up, we've got a couple minutes to go yet. I'd like to give everybody a little sneak preview about the next week up and coming program before we get started for the day. So, this week's program is going to be The First Life. We're going to cover a lot of time, billions of years, in fact. Now, next week, we actually kind of pick up where this program leaves off. We're going to be talking about sea monsters. And among those is a crowd favorite. This is a shark tooth. You can see quite a large shark tooth. This isn't the biggest one in our collection either. This is a tooth from a Carcharodon megalodon. And megalodon shark, it's kind of famous these days as the biggest predatory fish, the biggest predatory shark that's ever existed. And they probably were. They were a very large fish. Estimates from the size of the teeth and from the fossils that we do have indicate that they could have gotten up to be about 60 feet long. So roughly the size of a modern day humpback whale. Now, a really neat thing about megalodon, it's kind of an often overlooked fact, is that unlike the dinosaurs that we've talked about in previous programs and most of the ancient animals that we have in the museum here, Megalodon was alive when people were alive. Some of the very earliest people to travel from Siberia and East Asia across the Pacific, across the Bering Strait, and down the California, Oregon, Washington, and Canadian coastlines there, could have potentially looked over the edge of their canoes and seen one of these sharks swimming underneath them. Megalodon was around up until about 10 to 12,000 years ago, around the same time the woolly mammoth went extinct. So some of the very first people to come to North America could very easily have lost a fish on the line to a Megalodon shark. Now, I heard my 1 o'clock alarm, so looks like it's about time to start our program for the day. Thanks for coming, everybody. Welcome. We're here at Colossal Fossils in Wausau, and if you're new to the program today, my name is Sean. You can go Cave Sean, Mammoth Hunter. In future programs, we're going to be talking a lot about what I do for the museum. Called experimental archaeology. Basically, I take an artifact and I build a reproduction of it, and I take it out and I use it to learn more about how our ancestors survived and did what they did, why they did things in a certain way. Today, we're going way, way farther back in time than I usually hang out. To start the program, we're actually going to go back to the very beginning. 13.8 billion years ago. Now, at this time, we're really not entirely sure what was going on. 13.8 billion years is the date given to the Big Bang. And well, science has come to that date mostly because that's as far out into the universe as we can see distance-wise. And so we can use the speed of light and distance to kind of come up with a rough estimate as to when it all began. current theory is that there was a thing, and that thing was made up of everything that is, was, and ever will be, and it was a little tiny, super dense clump of thing. And for some reason it existed and then exploded, and that created the universe. Like I said, it's a lot of theory and actually a lot of physics that's a little bit over my head, if I'm completely honest. Now, from 13.8 billion years forward, things get interesting, at least interesting to us because, well, we live in the universe, right? So for about 10 billion years, the universe does its thing. Nebulas form, elements, molecules, well, everything that we see when we look up into the night sky forms bit by bit, piece by piece, very slowly over a very long period of time. Now, if we start at 13.8 billion years, it's not until 4.5 billion years ago that the Earth starts to actually form. Now, at this point, the Earth is not like, what you see when you look out the window, right? 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system was still mostly dust. Like, it was just starting to clump together and form planets to gravity. Now, how do I want to say, the conditions in this early solar system were, well, hostile to life. The very young, newly formed Earth was actually more lava than Earth. It was bombarded by solar radiation. It didn't have an atmosphere to speak of. And we can kind of figure this out by actually analyzing the oldest rocks that we can find, what chemicals are in them and how they formed. Well, very, very slowly, over a very long period of time, the Earth cooled down by mechanisms that I'm not really clear on, and I don't think most scientists are either. We ended up with an atmosphere. We got water. A lot of scientists actually think the water came from ice, from comets that were hitting the Earth and kind of brought water in from other places. And eventually the Earth becomes, well, a little bit more recognizable as the Earth. Now, prior to 3.5 or so billion years ago, we had an atmosphere which it was mostly nitrogen, carbon dioxide, sulfur. It was poisonous gases. Like if you went back 3.5 billion years and walked around the surface of the Earth, you'd need a spacesuit. You wouldn't be able to breathe. The Earth itself, well, it didn't even have dirt yet. Nothing like today. You might get sand, but most of the surface of the Earth was made up of stuff like this. This is a piece of Wisconsin red granite. And well, this is what the bedrock is made of. Things like granite and basalt and silica, quartzite, what we call igneous rocks. They're rocks that form out of lava. And well, nothing grows on these, right? You might get moss, but we'll get to moss in a little bit. At this very early stage, we finally get little tiny fossil evidence, bits of fossil evidence, little tiny trace fossils of the formation of the very first life. Now, we don't know how it happened. There's several theories out there about different chemicals mixing together in different environments formed the first sort of clump of molecules that was able to make another clump. Some people even think it fell from space on comets. I don't know about that myself, but neither does anybody else. Now, the very first life forms on Earth, well, by our standards, they weren't very impressive. they looked like these, and we call them prokaryotes. Now, prokaryotes really don't look like much. They're bacteria. If you take out a microscope or open up a library book and you look at a picture of a bacteria, it looks like a little bag full of jelly with hairs on the outside, and it sort of moves around. They don't do much. Now, these very first bacteria, they really didn't do much. We think they were probably just eating minerals out of the water as they floated around and just sort of existing. And they actually went on like that for 500 million years, 500 million years. This is a very long time. Just to really show how much time we're talking here, the dinosaurs, from the very first dinosaur to the very last dinosaur, were around for less than 150 million years. It took almost 3 times that for bacteria to learn how to use light to make energy, something we call photosynthesis. And so let's start to get bacteria like these little guys. Prokaryotes with light-sensitive chemicals, light-sensitive cells that they eventually started using to not only determine day and night. We think they would actually float to the surface during the day and eat sunlight and then sink at night and sit on the bottom when it was dark, kind of like some modern protozoans and algae type plants and stuff do today. But they were actually photosynthesizing. Now, has anybody talked about photosynthesis in science class? No? All right, so it's a big word, but what it means is making energy from light, particularly from sunlight. When you look outside and you see all those green leaves and trees and plants and grass, every single plant outside of your window is using photosynthesis to convert the sunlight into energy so that it can live and grow. It's a slow process, which is why things like trees and grass grow slowly, but it's something that, well, it hadn't been done before. It also allowed these very first photosynthetic bacteria to produce their own food. They didn't have to do the long and difficult process of eating rocks, right? Now, interesting fact, we actually think that the first photosynthesizing cells, the first prokaryotes to do this, were purple. So the leaves on the trees and the grass, they appear green because they absorb the purple and blue light and the red and yellow light on opposite ends of the spectrum, and they reflect green light. So they look green to us. We think these first cells actually absorbed the green light because there's more energy in it. And they reflected colors like blue and purple. So these very oldest algae blooms may have been red or blue or purple instead of green. To confirm that, though, we'd have to go back in time and check. Now, life on Earth kind of drifts around and floats and exists like this as just a couple different kinds of bacteria for a really long time. I'm talking 1 billion years with a B, okay? That's 1,000 million years. It's a very long time. But eventually, by natural selection, by mutation, these bacteria, they finally change into a very, very important thing for us called a eukaryote, a eukaryotic cell. And that looks like this. If you look at a eukaryotic cell under a microscope, well, it looks kind of like a fried egg. It's got a nucleus. It's got a couple little bits of what we call organelles, little structures inside the cell that work like our internal organs. Each one does a separate thing for the cell. Some of them digest nutrients, some of them clean out the waste. The nucleus seems to kind of organize everything, sort of like a little tiny miniature brain. But eukaryotic cells, that structure is the cell structure that has built every single complex organism on this planet, from the simplest multicellular algae all the way up to us. Bacteria never really got that far. But like I said, at this point, well, life has been on Earth for 1.5 billion years. Billion with a B. And it's only just gotten to that eukaryotic cell structure. It's another billion years of all those simple cells floating around and not really doing much before we start to get something that actually leaves a little bit of a fossil. Now, 1 billion years ago, all right, so what do we do a little math here? About 7 times older than the oldest dinosaur. Math's probably a little off, but really long time ago, we finally get the first multicellular life. And it's really simple stuff. If you went back in time and looked at it under a microscope, it would just be a bunch of the exact same kind of cell that clumps together. You know, it just looked like this. And you put on your spacesuit and you went back in time and you waded out into the salty, warm, bacteria-filled ocean water and stuck your helmet in and looked, you know what you would see? Sheets of algae, pond scum, that green slimy stuff we find when we go wading around in the frog pond and trying to catch fish. That was the most complex life on Earth 1 billion years ago. And it doesn't seem like much, but that really started it all. You see, fossils like this, there we go, where we can see these layers, that is the game changer. So these cells, these photosynthesizing cells, they start producing oxygen. And that's a very key, important proponent or part of the development of life. Another thing, all of those sheets and layers and masses of algae provided food for things basically like amoebas, these eukaryotic cells that needed something to eat. When we look at the fossil here, we don't actually find fossils of algae in here, but what we get are the layers of sediment, the layers of silt that form around the algae. See, each one of these pages or these layers is where you have a mat of algae that grows on the bottom of the water, and then silt and sediment get washed down over it, and a new layer of algae forms over that, over and over and over for hundreds and hundreds of years, until you get almost like pages of a book made in stone. Now, we move forward from this very first algae to about 800 million years ago. Finally, after all this time from the Big Bang, we're up into the hundreds of millions of years before present day. We're getting actually, in the span of universal time, very close to where we exist. We get the first evidence of, well, what we call simple animals. And they're really simple. Now, this, I expect everybody is going to recognize it. This is not an animal. This is a kitchen sponge. Now, this is important though, because today we make these synthetically. This is made in a factory. Historically, we actually would have used a real sea sponge, and a sponge is an actual living animal. If you put on some scuba gear and go scuba diving in the ocean, you can find a living sea sponge. They are the oldest animals, complex animals on Earth. They predate everything. They're kind of where it all started. Now, their structure internally is just like this kitchen sponge. They're full of tubes and hollows, and inside those they have little tiny hairs that actually pull water into the sponge and kind of usually squirt it out the top. And all they do, there's no brain, there's no thought in a sponge. They're kind of like an animal version of a plant. They just sort of sit there and they filter water. They pull bacteria, minerals, algae, all that stuff out of water. And that's what they do. They come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes and colors. And today they exist from the deep ocean up into places like coral reefs and that sort of thing. And they, you know, they just look like a sponge, which as animals go these days, I mean, we have a lot of variety to choose from. Sponges aren't really exciting, right? It's a sponge. But that is where it all started. For the next 250 to 300 million years, they very slowly started to evolve and change and diversify, which is to form different types. And eventually, we get some more interesting creatures. We get worms, which, you know, you go out after a rain on the sidewalk, there's earthworms crawling around, right? They're not really exciting, but unlike sponges, worms and jellyfish, they're the first animals that can move. They're not just stuck on a rock, sucking in water and eating what they can get that's nearby. They can actually move around, right? We start to get stuff like that. The bottom of the ocean, the seafloor, really starts to explode a little bit, very slowly, with the first forms of diverse life. Now, got a couple of very heavy fossils to show you here. The first one, actually both of them are from Wisconsin. The first one is from a town very close to me here called Mosinee. Now, it is a heavy fossil, but it's 500 million years old. Looking at this on the camera, it probably doesn't look like much, right? It's just a slab of stone. And you can kind of see the little bit of a round shape in the middle there. If I turn it on its side, you can see how that sticks up a little bit. And again, compared to, say, like a T-Rex jaw or a Triceratops skeleton, it's not a really exciting fossil. That is a very, very old jellyfish. And that bulge in the middle of the rock, that dome, that's the mantle, we call it, or the bell of the jellyfish, the part that swims. On this much smaller, more manageable one, we can show you a much better look at these guys. So that is the round part of the jellyfish that squirts water and swims through the ocean, and you can see all of the tentacles around. And there's two of them here. We got one up here, one down here. Now, in these ancient jellyfish, we don't know if their tentacles had stingers just yet. Modern jellyfish have very specialized cells on their tentacles called nematocysts. And if you look at a nematocyst under a microscope, they're a weird looking cell. They sort of sit inside out. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going past there. So they sort of sit inside out. They have a sharp point on them, and they're sensitive to touch. And when you touch them, they flip inside out, and it shoots out a little hair with a pointy end and barbs on it, like a harpoon, that's full of venom. It's full of poison. And that's how jellyfish can actually catch things like fish that are much faster than them and can, swim away. We don't know with these super ancient jellyfish if they had those yet. Probably not, because there wasn't much for them to actually catch other than maybe other jellyfish, an occasional worm if they got close to the bottom. Now, neat feature of this particular fossil, you can see the ripples. Those are the waves in the sand of a beach where the water kind of piles the sand up. You can see that same effect on lake shores and river shores and seashores and sandy beaches today. Except this one has been preserved for 500 million years. Now, this next fossil, because at this point, up until mid 500 million years ago, everything moving around in the ocean, it's all soft-bodied, slimy, squishy sheets of algae, stuff's just kind of crawling along the mud, eating algae and, mud and dirt and sediment, or the jellyfish are swimming around, probably filtering at this point, not actually stinging anything. But because all of this stuff is so soft and squishy, we don't get a lot of good fossils of it. Occasionally we find things like a kind of a flatworm called Dickinsonia. Animals related to that, where they really just look like if you take some silly putty and squish it and put it down on the table, there's not much to them. It's even hard to tell which end's the front end and which end's the back end. But we start finding trace fossils. We've talked about trace fossils a little bit, things like footprints. So this next fossil, it's going to take me a second, weighs about 65, 70 pounds, but it's worth lifting up so you can see it on the camera. This is the biggest fossil I get to show off today. There we go. That is really big. Now, we call these climactocnides. And what this is a super ancient worm highway. Now you can look at this rock and the entire face of it is covered with tracks, these sort of almost tire track looking trails. And that's from worm-like critters, sea slug type critters moving like this across the mud on the ocean floor, eating algae and leaving their tracks. We don't have their bodies, we don't have their remains because their soft squishy bits got eaten by other soft squishy critters. And so we don't know. We've never found fossils of them. But we find lots of tracks like this. And fossils like this show up all over Wisconsin. There's a good chance if you're in the right place, you could actually find a fossil like this that is hundreds of millions of years older than even the first life forms to leave the water. Now I'm going to put this back down because it's really heavy. There we go. It's a really neat fossil, but it's just huge. Now, 500 million years ago, when tracks like that were being formed, when fossils like our jellyfish were being formed, Wisconsin was the bottom of an ocean. It was underwater. Where I'm sitting right here, not only would I have needed scuba gear, but I would have actually needed deep sea equipment. I'd be about 300 feet underwater. Need some serious heavy duty breathing apparatus for that. Can't hold my breath that long. Now, what's neat about this time period is that it really starts to kick things into high gear, because with all of these worms kind of crawling around and all of these jellyfish swimming around, we get the very first predation. The first animals that actually start eating other animals. Now, that's a huge step when it comes to evolution, because predation, predator-prey relationships are a major force in natural selection. And so we start to get some really neat developments. For example, shells, spikes, and pretty quickly here, even legs. Now, if you go to the lake shore around Lake Michigan or up north, Lake Superior, you might be able to find a rock like this. This is called a Petoskey stone. When I was a little kid growing up in Michigan, we used to go up and down the beach looking for these things. And if they're dry, they usually just kind of look light gray, like that. This one's been polished up a bit. If you get a little water on them, you can see this pattern. It sort of magically appears. Now, what this is coral. Really, really ancient fossilized coral that's been washed back and forth on the beach for a long time, so it turns into a smooth rock. When it's a fossil, it looks kind of more like this stuff. Now, this looks like a bee's nest, like a fossilized beehive, but it's actually what we call honeycomb coral. And each one of these little cells, these little compartments, was the home of a coral polyp. And this stuff, even though it's 500 million years old, it's just like modern day coral. These little polyps are like a jellyfish that's flipped upside down and stuck itself to a rock, and it uses its tentacles to grab little bits of food as they float by. But because it's stuck there and it's soft, it needs something for protection from things like sea slugs. And so it builds this shell out of calcium carbonate, if I remember right. It's rock. It's a soft rock, but it's still a rock. It's really hard if you're a worm. And some of these corals, like that big spiky one back behind me there, get to be really big. This thing is huge, weighs about 80 pounds. So we're going to leave it there. Now, corals and their close relatives called crinoids are really important to us because they actually leave physical traces. They leave evidence. Our crinoids, they kind of look like plants, like this. They're sort of a wormy sort of creature. And we start to find tubes like this from crinoid stems where they, they're taller than the coral polyp, so they reach up higher and filter stuff out of the water with kind of a feathery tentacles. But they basically do the same thing. Different types of coral like this. And today, there's dozens and dozens of different types of coral all over the world, from super cold to super warm tropical waters. The most famous is like the Australian Great Barrier Reef. And these corals, they're all little tiny animals. They're like the size of a dime, but they work as a colony, as a group, to build these huge walls of stone over time. And they're kind of sensitive to their environment. We actually have to be really careful if we, say, go snorkeling or scuba diving around a coral reef. If you poke at it and touch it too much, you can actually damage it. So coral, it's been around for a long time. It's a very successful little animal, but we kind of have to take care of them, to be careful with them. Now, some of these worms and sea slugs, they took a cue from coral and they started to build shells too. We start to see the first things like this. This is called a barnacle. And barnacles still exist today. They're in the mollusk group, kind of like slugs and snails and that sort of thing. And they're filter feeders. They put out little tentacles and catch particles as they float by. They stick these shells to anything to the bottom, to rocks, sometimes whales' faces, and today actually, sometimes even ships. Uh, there are like big ocean freighters sometimes will get so many of these stuck to the hull that it'll slow the ship down. And they actually have to have somebody put on scuba gear and go underwater and scrape all the barnacles off of the ship so that it doesn't sink. How'd you like that job, huh? Now, another type of critter that we still have today, things like sea urchins and sand dollars. This is a sand dollar. This one is about 500 million years old. And if I had a modern day sand dollar with me to hold up next to it, they look almost identical. They haven't changed in 500 million years. Now, just like our barnacle, it's a soft, squishy inside with tasty bits and a hard shell on the outside. These lines here, this pattern on top, are actually holes in the shell where it pulls water in, eats the food out of the water, and then squirts the water back out. And you can find these on beaches all over the world. They're close cousins. The sea urchins have a hard shell that's usually covered in sharp spikes. If you've ever seen video of a sea otter, you'll see them picking up urchins off the bottom and using rocks to crack those shells open. Well, back at this time, no sea otters. So those spikes kept them safe from worms. Now, some of these worms and slugs, these things, they took a different route. And about 540 million years ago or so, we start to get some more recognizable animals. We get the first animals that burrowed into the sediment, into the soil to hide and to hunt. We get the first animals with a really recognizable face. We get the first animals that actually learned how to swim in a direction, like they, not like jellyfish where they just kind of drift around, but they actually get to pick and choose where they're going. They can chase things or escape from things. So 541 million years ago, we get into the Cambrian period. And all of a sudden we get these little guys. Now, does anybody recognize this fossil? Yeah, a couple of you. This is a trilobite. Trilobites are a super common fossil. During their day, they may have actually been the most common animal on Earth. They were super, super successful. It took, I believe it was 3 major extinction events to kill them off. They existed for more than twice as long as the dinosaurs, 300 million years. And over that span of time, there were more than 20,000 species. So put that into perspective. The great apes, the kind of the group that we belong to as hominids, there's only 6. And the oldest human beings on Earth, they appeared about 300,000 years ago. Tiny fraction of the time that trilobites were around. These guys were super, super successful. Now, we don't think they were good swimmers. We think they were bottom dwellers. Does anybody know what a pill bug is? Potato bugs, roly-polies? Well, okay, if you flip over a rock in the backyard in the garden, or roll over a rotten log, you see a lot of bugs. One of those bugs that you're likely to see are these little tiny guys, about the size of a pea or a grain of rice. And if you poke at them, a lot of them will roll up into a little ball. Some of them just run away. They're a little flatter. Those are called isopods. A lot of people call them pill bugs or potato bugs or sow bugs, that sort of thing. They're the closest living relative to trilobites. Now, they're like a distant cousin. They're not a direct descendant. But a lot of their behaviors are pretty similar. There's even a species of isopod today that's about the size of a football that lives in the deep ocean and scavenges fish and stuff that sink to the bottom. We think that's basically a modern version of a trilobite. Now, some of these trilobites you look at the segments in the shell, they could actually curl up into little balls and hide inside of their armor. See, arthropods like this, they developed an exoskeleton, and that's a shell that completely covers the outside of the body. And if all the predators walking around are worms with soft, squishy mouth parts, and you're made of hard armor, all of a sudden, nothing can eat you. But, well, evolution doesn't like to let you not get eaten for a long time. So over time, arthropods diversified. Our trilobites, for example, got bigger, they got sharper. This one here has spikes on the side of his head, and the shape of his head actually allows him, as he's crawling along the bottom, to burrow into the sediment. He can use his face like a shovel. Right up here, he's got eyes kind of like dragonfly eyes or like fly eyes. He's actually got decent eyesight. He can see predators coming, and that's a good thing because it didn't take long with all those trilobites wandering around for evolution to produce something that would eat them. I would like to introduce you to an animal that we don't have a fossil of in the museum just yet, but it's important to our story of the first life. This is an arthropod, like a trilobite, called Anomalocaris. And it is, well, sort of a really hungry version of a modern day shrimp. This animal was crazy. It had big eyes on the end of stalks like a snail, but it's all hard shell. It's an arthropod, like a modern bug or a crab or a shrimp, and it's related to shrimps. Instead of legs, it grew hard flippers, paddles like this down the sides, and when it swam, it would move those like this. So it could swim around, it could steer itself. In its world, it was the fastest predator that we know of. And on the front end here, it had these spiky armor-plated tentacles that faced backwards. And what it would do is swim up to something and put those out, scoop it up off the bottom, and hold it up underneath the head, beneath the eyes, and that's where it had crunching, chewing mouth parts. This thing was a top predator. And you can see it's going after our little trilobite buddy there. Now, this group, this weird looking swimming predator, this Anomalocaris, they eventually developed into a group of animals that I'm sure most of you will recognize from the seafood buffet, shrimps. Now the family group, the group that they're a part of, that trilobites are a part of, arthropods, that includes, well, all of your favorite shellfish at the seafood buffet, you know, crab, lobster, shrimp, any bugs in the backyard from butterflies to mosquitoes. And all of the scorpions, spiders, centipedes, millipedes, anything we think of as a bug or a creepy crawly started out in the arthropod family. That is a very old crab. He would have had his eye stalks up here and his little claws in the front. Now, as arthropods diversified and got really good at catching and eating other animals, everything in the ocean had to develop faster and faster. So during the Cambrian, we see an absolute explosion of life. Those soft, squishy little worms, some of them stay soft, squishy little worms, but they get good at burrowing under the sediment and hiding. They develop defenses. Many of the modern ones, like sea slugs, are actually quite poisonous. And I can get a handful of these here. There we go. a lot of them develop different types of shells, like our gastropods here. Now, gastropods are those soft, squishy slugs that took their armor-plated defense and made it into a mobile home. These are hundreds of millions of year-old seashells. And just for comparison, here's a gastropod, a seashell. Like I said, it's several hundred million years old. It's an ancient, ancient seashell. This is a mud snail from a local pond that I collected the shell from this summer. They haven't changed because their defensive system, their armor works so well. And most of these water snails like this, or aquatic snails, they actually have a little door. So as they scooch along the bottom and eat mud and algae, a fish comes up to them, they pull into their shell, and then they've got a little hard plate that closes that off like a door. So they're completely enclosed in their mobile hiding place. Some species went a slightly different route with their shell. I ended up like this guy. Now, modern day clams, mussels, oysters, scallops, things like that, they're all what we call bivalves. They have that good, hard, thick shell, but it's hinged on the back here like a door. When they're slithering around with their soft, squishy selves, they move like a snail. They hold the shell up like this. But when something threatens them, they pull inside of it and clamp it shut with a muscle that attaches the top and bottom shell together and holds that closed tightly. Unless you're able to break the shell or have something that you can get in there and detach that muscle, they're really hard to get into. Some of these guys actually get to be very big. Modern day species of this guy can get to be about 6 feet across, these huge ocean clams. Now, a small portion of this group was predatory. And actually in the ocean today, there's an animal called a cone snail in some tropical oceans. It is one of the most venomous, most dangerous animals alive today. So it's just a snail. It's not huge. It lives on the bottom of the ocean. It crawls along really slowly, spends a lot of time kind of buried in the sand, but it eats fish. And it's developed a spike and venom that is super, super toxic. When it stings a fish, this venom paralyzes the fish so quickly that the snail doesn't even have to chase it. It just pulls it into its mouth and swallows it whole like a snake. A different group of these gastropods, of these hard-shelled, squishy little critters, developed into another group that we still have with us today, the cephalopods. Cephalopods are really neat because they've diversified a fair amount over the years. Some of them got to be very, very large. Some of them today are very intelligent. Now, we don't know how smart the early ones were. It's really hard to tell how smart something is from a fossil. But we know how big they were. Now, these are small. This is a belemnite, or an orthocone, and it's like a squid, except the body is a hard shell. This tube is solid shell. And his little head stuck out of this end with his tentacles trailing behind. Orthocones like this could get to be as long as a school bus. They were huge, as big as giant squid today, easily. This right here, this kind of snail shell shaped spiral, comes from an ammonite. Now, ammonites were very, very common. They actually survived right up to the end of the Cretaceous extinction event. They died out along with the dinosaurs. Some of them could get to be up to 6 feet across. And believe it or not, ammonites are the Wisconsin state fossil. Because remember, Wisconsin was under the ocean for a long period of time. And so when we find dinosaur era fossils in Wisconsin, down in the driftless zone in the southwest corner of the state, what we find are animals that lived in the ocean, things like ammonites. This is a good sized example of our ammonite. Over time, ammonites developed all kinds of different shapes and structures to their shells. This one had ridges of reinforcement. So when something like our Jurassic Park or Jurassic World mosasaur came up and tried to eat him, it'd be really hard to crunch that shell. Some of them got really smooth and slippery, so they'd be hard to get a hold of. Some of them actually developed spikes. Some of them just got really, really big. Depending on where you find the fossils, most of them are smaller when we find them, like these guys. But depending on where they were when they fossilized, come on, camera. There we go. Depending on where they were when they fossilized, they can get to be really, really nice fossils. You can even see his little face on the end there. We've even seen examples of ammonite shells that fossilized with reflective minerals called opal. We call it an opalized fossil. So it's like an ammonite shell 3 feet across that reflects rainbow colors when the light shines on it. In life, we think they probably would have looked very much like this. Quite similar to deep sea cephalopods today we call chambered nautilus. And just like our water snails, we think they had a hard plate over top of their head so that when they pulled back into their shells, it kind of closed the door and made them really hard to eat. Like I said, we don't know how smart these guys were, but modern cephalopods, squid, cuttlefish, octopus, they're very intelligent. They're very social. Octopus are capable of solving puzzles. There's actually multiple cases that are documented where an octopus leaves its aquarium, crawls over to the aquarium next to it, eats all the fish and clams, and then crawls back and goes into its little hiding place. So the aquariums next to it just turn up empty all of a sudden. And squid have actually been documented hunting in packs, just like wolves. They communicate with each other by flashing colors, by changing this color of their skin, and they'll distract fish and then come up from underneath. There's even scuba divers that have been attacked by them. The largest cephalopods, the largest squid today, like those orthocones, can get to be really big. At this time in the ocean, they were actually the largest predatory animals to have ever existed. Now, that brings us up to the end of an era called the Ordovician. And the Ordovician, we saw the very first kind of versions of fish. Fish at this time, they looked more like what we call hagfish today. They're really gross, slimy, eel-looking fish. They don't have bones. We call them jawless fish because they have mouths, but they're really more like a worm than they are like what we think of as a fish. And next week's program, when we get into sea monsters, we're going to talk a lot more about fish. We're going to see some neat fossils kind of like this guy. But we're going to talk about groups of fish that include what we call the placoderms. And they developed after this Ordovician period, when things start to get really, really neat in the oceans. And we begin to see some real sea monsters, the things we think of as being in the ancient oceans, you know, the mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, sea scorpions, giant sharks. That all started in this Ordovician explosion. And side note, that Ordovician period when those giant squids or giant orthocones are swimming around, that is when we finally get the first plants leaving the water and starting to colonize the land, starting out as little types of moss and actually fungus that finally made the atmosphere out of the water breathable for, well, all of the future animals we think of as being ancient creatures like dinosaurs, the metrodons, pterosaurs, things like that. Now, I heard my beeper alarm go here, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. I know we've talked a lot about a lot of neat fossils, a lot of stuff. If you want to see any of these closer up again, be happy to bring them up to the camera and show you and answer any questions you've got about the program today. Any questions from anybody? Sorry, I think your mic's
Sorry.
There you go.
He had a question about, was it a cephalopod?
The squid-like animals? Yeah, what's your question?
How big could they get up to?
Well, the biggest fossils that we find are from the long straight ones here, what we call Orthochirus, and they could get to be as long as your school bus.
Wow.
And as big around as I am tall, more than 5 feet across. Now, it's a little harder to know for sure how long their tentacles got because their only bones were those big shells. But looking at modern squids and cuttlefish, we think that the tentacles could be probably 6 feet long, longer probably than your parents are tall. And they use those with section cups to pick up things like trilobites and sea scorpions. And their mouth actually looks like a parrot beak. They have evolved to crunch through shells, and then they use a spiky tongue to lick out the soft insides.
Wow.
Kind of gross and weird looking, but neat. Modern squids and cuttlefish, if you actually look up videos of them, they even have special tentacles that are longer than the rest of them that they use to catch stuff. They'll swim up to something like a shrimp and shoot these arms out, grab it, and pull it back to their shorter tentacles where they hold on to things while they eat. It's really neat to see. They do it very, very quickly. But with an orthocone, you can imagine it, instead of being, a foot long, being the size of a school bus.
Wow. What do you say?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, looks like Hunter, there you go.
Question.
Yeah.
I want to talk about this.
Oh, you've got a gastropod shell. So yeah, that looks like actually the same kind of shell as these guys. So gastropods like that are one of these animals that they actually still exist today. They're still in the world with us now. If you go out into the garden and you find a snail, that is a distant relative, a descendant of that type of animal, that super early snail. That one, that looks like that might even be an ammonite. Like the snail shell with a squid head. Now, today, these little spiral shelled critters, these gastropods, you can find them all over the world in pretty much any environment that's not a desert or Arctic conditions. They don't like super cold, frozen conditions, but they like cool, damp places, or they like to be underwater, like our pond snail. Oh, I'm not sure what that one is. That almost looks like stratified soil. That's kind of neat. All right. We got just a couple minutes left. Was there any other questions?
I found this in my own backyard.
Oh, okay. That looks, from what I can see on the camera, that one looks like another type of barnacle, similar to these guys. These are animals, they're kind of like the gastropods, like the snails. They stick onto stuff, and the soft little part is inside the shell, and they pull water in to eat particles of food as it floats by.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What's the nearest college with a paleontology class?
Well, I'd have to look that up to be sure. I know the UW-Madison has some paleontology programs, or they did several years ago.
Midwest.
Oh, and Arrowhead too. That's neat. A lot of places do actually have some kind of paleontology program. If you're, you probably have a few years before you're ready to go off to college. The library is a great place to find books about paleontology. And like myself, I went to school, of course, but over the past 20 years, I've done a lot of study on my own time. So even if you're not quite ready to go off to college, you can always find some books and read up on it and learn yourself. Then when you get to your paleontology program,
Found this when we went to
class.
Texas.
Oh, I'm not sure what that one is. That almost looks like a lava bubble. That's kind of a neat rock. You guys have a neat collection.
No, it's dino poop.
Oh, it's a coprolite. Okay. It's a little hard to see on some of the cameras. So a coprolite is one of those trace fossils. It's basically dino poo. So it looks like we're right up at the end of our time here. So I want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us here at Colossal Fossils today for the first life. And thank you for the questions and joining with us. Like I said, next week is sea monsters, and we're going to be talking about some big fish.
Oh, that is
Along with some very famous other sea monsters and a few things that you may never have heard of, but you're going to really like. So, again, thanks everybody for showing up and hanging out with me today. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.